Hey everybody, this is Kevin Bass from thedietwars.com, and I'm here to talk to you today about Andrew Huberman's extremely unhealthy fasting practices and why it is probably contributing, almost certainly contributing to his obesity. First reason I started talking about this was yesterday or the day before. I made a video about how his tweet was made up about intermittent fasting being easier to adhere to. And I'm going to talk more about this particular subject in the next video, because I'm going to talk about the details, the four main details that you need to understand about what we've learned about intermittent fasting over the past couple decades and how you can apply it to your life. But for the purpose of this video, I just want to provide context. The context is I saw this tweet, I'll read it for you. There is nothing inherently better about intermittent fasting versus caloric restriction except the glaring truth. Most people find it easier not to eat for a period of time than to eat small portions. It is all about dopamine. Ignoring the neural side of nutrition is a mistake. And I just pointed out this is just complete nonsense. He made it up, and he continues here with more made up stuff. He says, in fact, many people who do intermittent fasting come to enjoy the non-feeding phase and enjoy food more. Again, it's dopaminergic. Do as you wish and as healthy as for you, but skip the fasting versus X debates online. They miss that it's not about the nutrients. It's about adherence. I showed very clearly that people who fast actually have lower adherence than people who don't fast, and people who say just do consistent meal timing actually have much higher adherence than people who fast, and the people who fast also have more muscle loss and don't have any greater weight loss at all. And somebody sent me a few more messages from Dr. Huberman, and I wanted to go address those here because his fasting practices are extremely unhealthy. And as I think I mentioned earlier, they may be, or they are contributing to his obesity almost certainly. Who is Dr. Huberman? It's important to introduce that fact first before we continue. He's a professor of the School of Medicine at Stanford. He's a social media phenomenon. Over the last year, he's grown from almost nothing to 250,000 followers on Twitter, and I think he's probably over 1 million on Instagram. He has the biggest health influencer platform on the internet. He is the hottest, or maybe in North America, he is the hottest new thing among health influencers. And he's a neuroscientist. He's not a nutrition expert. He's not a weight loss expert. He's not any of those things. He's a neuroscientist, but he pontificates as if he is a nutrition expert, and it's getting him into trouble now because he's saying stuff that's patently not true. And the irony, though, that I want to get to now in this particular video/podcast is that he actually does things that are extremely unhealthy and probably contributes to his obvious weight problems. Now, before I continue, I want to point out very clearly, having obesity, being obese, having too much body fat that's good, then is good for health. Okay, an excess amount of body fat to the point that it's unhealthy. There's nothing morally wrong about this. There's nothing. It's not a moral failing that he has this. There's nothing to laugh at about this. Most of my family, or if not all of my immediate family is either overweight or obese, and I actually think they're all obese, all of my immediate family, and most of my extended family is overweight or obese. We have diabetes in my family. I've had obesity in the past. I struggle to maintain a lean body mass. I don't judge anybody for that. It's mostly a brain-related issue. Yes, self-control factors in. It's a modest risk. It's a modest protective factor on the population level. So-called self-control. People who have more so-called self-control. Certainly, willpower can influence weight, but for the overwhelming majority factor, the overwhelming factor is simply brain chemistry. Some people just enjoy eating more than others. And then, of course, we're in an environment that's flooded with food that's hyperpalatable and extremely calorie dense. And so those people who want to eat more than other people, who have these voracious appetites, of which I am one, have a greater tendency towards obesity. Of course, as I said, you can combat that with lifestyle factors. But at the individual level, while that may be the case on the population level, it's simply not a manageable solution to the obesity epidemic to insist that everybody exerts willpower, because it's something that's determined by biology. Overwhelmingly, of course, as I said, there's mitigating risk, there's mitigating protective factors, but it's overwhelmingly driven by biology, the differences in brain chemistry, as I said. Okay, cool. But okay, so whenever I say that Dr. Huberman is obese and I'm linking that to his extremely unhealthy fasting practices, I'm not saying that as a condemnation. I'm pointing that out within a certain very specific context, which I'm going to now elucidate. Now, let's talk about what that context is. He says here in a response to somebody says, I thought you had professed the science behind getting positive effects of fasting with smaller feeding windows beyond eating at a deficit or at maintenance. Fasting seemed to be even better for you than simply eating at a deficit. And Huberman says, there are preliminary data on possible additional effects, but the human studies need larger sample sizes. If I use intermittent fasting, but I don't want to eat early day ever and never have, because I want sun, caffeine, reading, and training prior to 11 a.m., then eat at 11 to 8-ish and sleep from 10 to 6-ish. Okay. This is really important because he's telling us how he actually eats. And what he does is he waits till the afternoon. He waits till the afternoon to start eating. Or he waits till noon to start eating as opposed to starting early in the morning. And this is extremely important because it violates certain constraints on circadian biology as far as eating early versus late. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to talk about that in just a moment, but I want to further clarify exactly what he's doing and why it is so extremely unhealthy and how it is actually translating into the way that he talks about food as a non-expert in nutrition and makes recommendations as a non-expert in nutrition, yet the largest health influencer in North America. And this becomes quite harmful, in fact, to the extent that he does have such a large influence. Let's look at this. So this one guy points out very interestingly, and I've been texting this guy a little bit because he has some of the same questions that I do. He says, can you share with us a typical eating day? If we extrapolate from the podcast, it sounds like morning yerba mate, lunch salad with a small amount of protein plus sauerkraut, dinner carbs plus sauerkraut. And this guy says, the question, how do you get enough protein to maintain 225 lean pounds? It's interesting because this guy talks about this in a very diplomatic manner, but it's obvious if you look at Huberman's pictures, he's not maintaining a lean 225 pounds. His 225 pounds is not lean by any stretch of the imagination. We can just Google this real quick to see. So Andrew Huberman, he doesn't, that's not him. He like, is that him? Holy crap. Okay, maybe that's like, that may be an earlier version of him, a younger version, and this is him today. It's clear that he's put on some weight. The younger version, and then the version today. This is maybe even still the younger version. This is the one today. The gray haired, you can see very clearly the brown hair in the beard, and then it goes gray. And you can see that very clearly he's not a lean 225. He was, but not anymore. So let's look at that for a second. Let's look further at his habits. So, as I pointed out, he doesn't eat any carbs at all until dinner. Now, as I've said, this is an extremely unhealthy way of going about eating. Even if he was able to maintain leanness, this would still be suboptimal and would still at least partly undermine any sort of health. It would at least partly undermine some of the health benefits of being lean, the unhealthy way in which he's going about this. And the evidence is quite strong. That eating in this particular way actually predisposes people to obesity and to weight gain and fat gain. All right, I'll say that again. Eating your carbs and loading your calories into a later feeding window almost certainly predisposes one to metabolic problems as well as fat and weight gain. The way that he is actually going about eating is predisposing him to obesity or overweight. And in this case, since he's 225 pounds, he's actually technically obese. And I don't believe that this is a lean 225 pounds. If you look at his picture, his younger pictures, yeah, he looks fit. His pictures now, he certainly doesn't. So I think the case that I'm making here is that his particular way of eating is predisposing him to this obese BMI, which is not all muscle, and this is actually influencing his science communication in a harmful manner since he's not an expert and doesn't know how to talk about this with the proper level of competence. Okay, let's be clear. He shouldn't be talking about nutrition. Andrew Huberman shouldn't be talking about nutrition because he's not competent to do so. And he excessively draws from anecdotes in order to make his claims about nutrition, which are often very false. So let's look further at that point that I just made. And to get at that, let's look at this thread that I wrote on my other account about Dr. Sinclair, who claimed that he ate one meal in the evening as opposed to eating throughout the day. He justifies this in all these weird, hokey evolutionary terms. He talked about this on Rogan. And I'm just pointing out in this particular thread, it was done in October 2021, that this is an extremely unhealthy way of doing things. Now, Huberman is a colleague. He's a colleague of Sinclair. They are both promoted by the same publicists. They're in the same company as far as their podcast is concerned and who produces it. And I believe Huberman created that company and then brought Sinclair on board. So they're quite close and they have essentially identical food timing practices, which are extremely unhealthy, as I pointed out in this thread. And I'm going to now go through that in some detail for the purpose of this video/podcast. This was a study done it was published in 2021, last year, in one of the Cell journals called Current Biology. It was a 12-person study, randomized crossover study. And there were two groups. Each group was given 3 meals and 2 snacks of comparable energy and macronutrient content with a 2-week washout period. What is a washout period? Well, so this is a crossover trial. And so for a crossover trial, each person is assigned to both of the groups. So they first undergo one particular intervention, then they have a washout period of 2 weeks, then they undergo the other intervention, and they're randomly assigned to each, and there's a random order. So half of the people in this study were assigned to, so the two groups were daytime and delayed intake. Daytime intake was 8 to 7 p.m. So 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Delayed was noon to 11 p.m. And this is an 11-hour eating window. It's the same for both groups, and they each got 3 meals and 2 snacks during this window. Cool. And it's the same. Sleep-wake cycles are the same. Exercise levels were the same. and they were all provided with the food. Okay. So what happened? Okay, to clarify this further, because I want to make sure that you guys understand how this was designed. Half of the people started at daytime feeding, and half the people started at delayed. And they each of these groups went for 8 weeks. Then there was 2-week washout period where they didn't do anything. They just went back to normal. And then they switched groups. Each person switched groups, and they went another 8 weeks in the opposite group. So each person was exposed to each of the conditions, so they can compare on each person the difference in what the outcome of each condition caused. Okay, cool. Here it says weight, adiposity, that is body fatness, energy expenditure, and circadian profiles of hormones and metabolites were assessed during 4 inpatient visits occurring before and after each condition. So body weight, insulin resistance, trunk to leg fat ratio, resting energy expenditure, respiratory quotient, and fasting glucose, insulin total, and high density lipoprotein, cholesterol, and adiponectin decreased on the daytime versus the delayed schedule of eating. That is to say, the people who ate earlier in the day, the condition into which they ate earlier in the day, caused them to have better body weight, lower insulin resistance, lower trunk to leg fat ratio, which is an indication of metabolic health, lower resting energy expenditure, which is complex. We're not going to be talking about that here. Lower respiratory quotient, lower fasting glucose, lower insulin, lower cholesterol, lower adiponectin. So they did much, much, much better in terms of their health according to almost every single measure you could possibly look at, if they ate earlier in the day as compared to later in the day. Okay? What this shows is all else equal, you're going to get worse metabolic health eating later in the day versus earlier. And the reason for this is probably related to insulin sensitivity with respect to carbohydrate content, as I'm going to be discussing in just a second. What this is saying is that if you have a late feeding window, if you basically don't eat in the morning, maybe don't even eat in the early afternoon, and then break your fast essentially in the evening, you're going to have worse metabolic outcome than if you did the same thing, but just made sure your meal was earlier in the day. In other words, this way of eating where you delay your feeding window until late in the day is extremely unhealthy. And this has been shown in many, many, many studies. This is a longer term study of 16 weeks or 18 weeks rather, if you include the washout period, right? This is a longer term study, but the acute short term mechanistic studies show the same thing. The way that Dr. Huberman is eating is extremely unhealthy compared to if he ate his calories earlier in the day. And I want to go look at the details of the study so you guys can understand the degree to which this is the case, okay? This is an 8-week study. This is just 8 weeks, okay? The difference in weight in each condition, so each person underwent each condition, the difference in weight is more than 1 kilogram. So it's almost 2.5 pounds or to 3 pounds in this case. A kilogram is 2.2 pounds, and it's more than 1 kilogram. It's almost 1.5 kilograms. So it's about 3 pound difference in 8 weeks. So in 8-week period, there's about a 3 pound difference. And as you can see here, only one person did better than the mean of what everybody else did in terms of better on the earlier feeding period. That is to say, only one person met has as much of an improvement on the delayed eating schedule as most people did on average on the early feeding schedule. So overall, overwhelmingly, the data point that people have a fairly uniform response. Now, of course, as I said, there's one person. I think, okay, there's two people, as I can see here. Actually, I missed one of the dots. There's two people who do better. And there's two people, and there's a few people, like two people who do worse, okay, on the earlier feeding window. I think those are the same. I think I'm trying to understand if this is the same person. In any case, it's overwhelmingly the case that the people who do, that most people do much better on the early feeding window than the later feeding window. And it's really important, before I go interpret the rest of the data here and talk about the rest of the data, even the people who did better on the later feeding window, that doesn't necessarily mean it's because of the later feeding window. There could be random variation of events, of life circumstances in those people's lives outside of the context of the study that could have added noise to this, so that those people who apparently did better on the delayed eating schedule may actually not have done better if you tested them over again. That is to say, it wasn't a biological issue related to the circadian rhythm. In this case, the time of eating. It wasn't related to the time of eating. It was related to some other factor outside the study that wasn't controlled by the study. That's another interpretation of some of the variation. The default interpretation of the study isn't necessarily that they simply did better on delayed feeding. It could have just been that there's a confound, some sort of other variable that intervened that was not controlled properly by the study because it couldn't have been controlled by the study design, and that undermined the consistency in the biology. It's quite possible that nobody really did better on the delayed feeding period, but some people, for other reasons other than delayed feeding, did better, but it's just a chance event and they wouldn't have done better otherwise. I hope that makes sense. But you can see a very, very consistent a mean difference in weight, about 3-pound difference, okay? Resting energy expenditure is similar. It's a very complicated outcome. Respiratory quotient is complicated. Lung, trunk to leg fat ratio, again, there's quite a large difference, and it's quite consistent with not much overlap. Cholesterol is quite a bit worse on average among the people who did delayed eating. Triglycerides are substantially worse, with one person doing extremely poorly with delayed eating. Glucose, that is to say, fasting glucose levels, are, on the order of 5 to 7 points worse on the delayed eating. Insulin levels are worse, and insulin sensitivity is much worse. Okay. So what does that mean? It means there's a fairly consistent, although with some variation, difference in the biology of eating early versus eating later. Now, this is really important when it comes to what Huberman says later. He says, let's see if we can find this. He says, I eat protein at night too, just less than at lunch. Lunch is 8 to 16 ounce of grass-fed meat or fish or eggs. So he eats meat and steak and eggs. I may drink some whey after training or just before lunch. I've stayed at healthy body fat, lipids, and weight for my high age. This way for 30 years with some fluctuations. He says for his height age, he stayed at a healthy body fat, meaning the implication is he's gained weight over the years. And he's basically saying, like, for my age, I'm staying at a healthy weight and healthy body fat. But he's clearly gaining weight, and he's clearly obese now. And he says, keep in mind that if I train really hard, I may increase intake here and there. Happy to share what I do in detail, blah, blah, blah. And then and he also says, I think blood work is key. I have no sugar cravings and don't drink. Never liked it, don't need it to relax. Everyone is different, but this is what works for me. I would question whether it really works for him. He hasn't posted his labs on the internet. He hasn't indicated what his fasting blood glucose, fasting insulin is, fasting triglycerides. My bet is he's not a diabetic, but he's not in really excellent health as far as his labs show. He's maybe in acceptable health, but he's clearly overweight and One of the technical terms you could use is he's over fat. He's at an obese BMI. He certainly has a substantial amount of muscle, but he has quite a bit of fat on him as well. And all of that is not muscle, that is for sure. So he says, everyone is different, but this is what works for me. Here's the question. Is everyone different? Is everyone different, and does this really work for him? Or is it that everyone has their own preferences and he prefers it this way, and he's going to ignore what the science says to try to pretend that his preference is what works for him? And then furthermore, make things up about intermittent fasting being easier to adhere to, even though he's not telling the truth about that. Because he wants to basically validate and rationalize his practices and then recommend those to other people. And he does this about a lot of things, by the way. He has these anecdotes that he then generalizes into broad recommendations for other people. He says, everybody's different. This is what works for me. But if you read his earlier tweet, this is quite polemical. It's like, it is all about dopamine, ignoring the neural side of nutrition is a mistake. This actually feels quite emotional. This doesn't feel like somebody impartially reporting the data. This sounds like somebody who's defensive. I want to really point that out. In fact, many people who do intermittent fasting come to enjoy the non-feeding phase and enjoy food more. Again, it's dopaminergic. Do as you wish and is healthiest for you. But skip the fasting versus X debates online. Why would you skip the debates if fasting, and especially his way of doing fasting, is unhealthy? Well, you'd skip the debates because he doesn't want you to have these debates. He doesn't want you to talk about this because he doesn't want to be criticized about it anymore. And he's like, they miss that it's not all about nutrients. It's about adherence. It isn't all about adherence. There's no data to support that intermittent fasting people have better adherence. In fact, they have worse adherence. It's very important to reiterate that. They have worse adherence. They have more muscle mass loss. And they don't do much better than chronic calorie restriction, if they do any better at all. And so why is he sort of saying these things? And I think it's because he's being defensive. He has this preferred practice that he enjoys, that he likes. And he says, everyone is different, but this is what works for me. This is what he prefers. It's actually not healthy. His way of fasting is very unhealthy on average. And I would suspect that it's not even just unhealthy on average, it's unhealthy for everybody. And now I'm going to go make that case in greater detail. Let's go proceed with that case. Let's continue a little bit with this one study I was talking about earlier and come to a conclusion. And then we're going to talk about the short-term mechanistic studies, which show very clear the trend and the effect of circadian biology on fasting and metabolism. So here's the conclusion in the abstract of that paper I was talking about earlier, the paper called Prolonged Controlled Daytime versus Delayed Eating Impacts Weight Metabolism. It says, overall, an 8-week daytime eating schedule compared to a delayed eating schedule promotes weight loss. Again, eating earlier in the day promotes weight loss and improvements in energy metabolism and insulin in adults with BMI of 19 to 27 kilograms per meter squared, underscoring the efficacy and feasibility of daytime eating as a behavioral modification for real-world conditions. That is to say, it's effective, it's efficacious to prescribe or help people modify their behavior so that they're eating earlier in the morning, because it's going to help their metabolic phenotype. And it's going to harm them to eat later. Let's talk about this in a second. But before that, I'm going to really summarize the way that I think Dr. Huberman gets things wrong. It is absurd. It is absurd. It is absurd to basically fast up until noon, not eat any carbs, and then eat all your carbs in the evening. That is the most unhealthy way you can possibly eat and time your eating that I can think of, according to a really robust body of literature showing this. He prefers this way, but it's extremely unhealthy. And as I pointed out with this study, it's probably contributing to his weight gain and his obesity as he gets older. Okay, let's look at this review article about, the title is Circadian Regulation of Glucose, Lipid, and Energy Metabolism in Humans. It's published in Metabolism in 2018. It's a fairly recent paper. Let's read this because this gives us a premonition of what's to come. We therefore also review evidence that circadian misalignment induced by mistimed light exposure, sleep, or food intake adversely affects metabolic health in humans. As it says, food intake, circadian misalignment induced by mistimed food intake adversely affects metabolic health in humans. That's what the evidence says. That's what the evidence says, that incorrectly timing your food intake, as Dr. Huberman is doing, he is incorrectly timing his food intake, and it is undermining his metabolic health and probably contributing to his obesity. And it says further, it says, these interconnections among the circadian system, metabolism, behavior underscore the importance of chronobiology for preventing and treating diabetes, obesity, and hyperlipidemia. Let's look at some of the relevant evidence. I can't read the whole paper to you, obviously, but I can read a few things that may shine a light on some important aspects. So let's look at section 2.1 and specifically section 2.1.1, diurnal studies. Diurnal studies just means how does, in a consistent rhythmic way, how does food intake, how is response to food intake change over the course of a day? And then, of course, over every day in a rhythmic, consistent manner. It says the first evidence for circadian regulation of glucose metabolism emerged in the late 60s and 70s. So before I continue here, I want to point out that this data has been available now for about 50 years, okay? This data has been available now for about 50 years that this is an extremely unhealthy way of eating that Dr. Huberman has that's contributing to metabolic dysfunction. And he's not showing any glimpse that he's aware of that. Why? He's not a nutrition expert. He's not a PhD in nutrition. He's not a PhD in anything food related. He's a neuroscientist. But he dips into nutrition because nutrition is hot. It's something you can talk about. It's something you can make money by making recommendations about, which is what he's doing. He's making a huge amount of money making recommendations about nutrition when he doesn't understand much about it. Okay, so these studies emerged in the 60s and 70s. Okay, when several studies reported that diurnal variations in glucose tolerance, Since then, more than a dozen human studies have reported the existence of a diurnal rhythm in oral glucose tolerance, typically peaking in the morning. So oral glucose tolerance peaks in the morning. That is to say, really, oral carbohydrate tolerance peaks in the morning, with impairments in glucose tolerance in the afternoon and evening. That is to say, if you eat glucose or eat carbohydrate in the afternoon or the evening, you're not going to tolerate it as well. You're not going to process it as well. It's going to perturb your metabolism compared to eating it in the morning. And that's what was showed by that first study that we talked about in a long-term manner. These have been shown in a more short-term manner, but it's shown mechanistically and in a very clear way. Importantly, these time of day effects are independent of the fasting duration. It doesn't matter how long you fast. The later you eat your carbohydrate, the worse off you are, the more unhealthy it is. And as we've seen with Dr. Huberman, he eats all his carbohydrate in the evening. He eats it in the evening. At the very end of the day, he fasts the entire day and eats in the evening. It's the worst, most unhealthy thing you can possibly do. Okay, studies using intravenous glucose or insulin tolerance tests and mixed meals have reported similar findings. However, fasting glucose is usually lower in the afternoon and evening than in the morning. That's not the response to glucose, that's your fasting glucose. But once you take glucose in, you have a larger response in the afternoon and the evening compared to the morning.
The size of the diurnal variation in glucose tolerance is strikingly large. Again, the size of the diurnal variation in glucose tolerance is strikingly large. Adults with normal glucose tolerance in the morning are metabolically equivalent to being pre-diabetic in the evening. So if Huberman has normal tolerance in the morning, he could have pre-diabetes in his glucose response in the evening by eating his carbs in the evening. This is the most unhealthy way you can possibly eat. And he's basically telling people that this is okay and good. It works for him. You guys need to be doing intermittent fasting because this is what works for me and this is what produces better adherence, which he completely invented. He invented that. He invented that completely because he's not a nutrition expert. He's not competent. And he says, and the paper says, more recently, we reported that oral glucose tolerance in pre-diabetic adults was 40 milligrams per deciliter higher at 7 p.m. than at 7 a.m., making pre-diabetic adults metabolically equivalent to early-stage diabetics at dinner time. So if he has a normal metabolism, he's basically becoming every single day pre-diabetic, which is really, really, really unhealthy. And it's probably contributing to his obesity, as I've mentioned. We're going to go continue reading in this paragraph. These diurnal variations in glucose tolerance can be partially traced to diurnal rhythms in beta cell responsiveness, insulin secretion, and insulin clearance. Although the existence of a diurnal rhythm in fasting insulin is mixed, the insulin secretory response varies across the day. Beta cell responsiveness, that is the cells in your pancreas that secrete the insulin, and this is as measured by glucose tolerance, mixed meal, or intravenous tolbutamide testing. We don't have to get into the technical specifics here, but in any case, it's higher in the morning than at other times of day. So you're responding more strongly in the morning than at other times of day. Yet, and this is extremely important, the insulin secretion rate and total insulin secreted in response to a meal appears to peak later in the day. And just to foreshadow and explain why that's the case, it's because your body responds to insulin much better earlier in the day, even though you secrete more in response to any given, even though you're secreting it more readily in response to any given glucose load, because your body's so responsive to it, you're actually ending up secreting less total insulin, which is good for you. You don't want insulin resistance because that's going to produce all sorts of negative metabolic phenotypes, was as we've seen in that earlier paper that we went through at the beginning of this video/podcast. And so the paper continues. It says, one trial using a 68-hour euglycemic and hyperglycemic clamps found that the insulin secretion rate peaked in the mid-afternoon and was lowest at night while participants were sleeping, obviously because they're not eating, okay? And then if you're going to be eating in the early afternoon or the mid-afternoon or evening, it's going to get even higher, okay? Similarly, trials employing intravenous glucose tolerance tests and mixed meals tests using C-peptide deconvolution analysis report that total insulin secretion is 16 to 51% higher in the afternoon or early evening than in the morning due to prolonged secretory period, even when no diurnal rhythm in the peak value of the secretion is apparent. Blah, 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 blah. Let's read this next paragraph because it's a little less technical, and I really want to make sure you understand these basic concepts. Rhythms in peripheral insulin sensitivity also appear to contribute to diurnal variation in glycemic control. In one trial employing frequently sampled intravenous glucose tolerance tests in normal weight participants, insulin sensitivity was impaired by 34% in the evening compared to the morning. That is to say, your body's simply not taking up the glucose in response to insulin. You have to increase your insulin secretion by 34% in order to get the same response, in order to decrease your glucose by as much as you would in the morning. Impairments in insulin sensitivity later in the day have also been confirmed using insulin tolerance tests, mixed meal tolerance tests using the triple tracer technique, constant glucose infusion procedures using isotope tracers, and a 24-hour glucose-controlled insulin infusion procedure reminiscent of a clamp. What does that mean? It just means like all sorts of different ways of looking at the same phenomenon all come up with the same exact conclusion. It's very consistent across techniques and methods, meaning it's a really robust phenomenon. And as you said earlier, it's a strikingly large effect. The diurnal variation in glucose tolerance is strikingly large.
Again, adults with normal glucose tolerance in the morning are metabolically equivalent to pre-diabetics, and pre-diabetics in the morning are metabolically equivalent to early stage diabetics at dinner time. You don't want to be eating your carbs at dinner. Okay? Cool. And let's continue on where we were just now. About 15% of transcripts, that is to say your messengers that signal that you want to create certain proteins that then do certain functions in the body, about 15% of these transcripts in skeletal muscle exhibit a rhythmic pattern, including genes involved in glucose and lipid metabolism. Muscle and liver glycogen content exhibit a 17% peak to trough variations, peaking in the evening. That meaning you're basically storing up your glucose all throughout the day, and it gets the highest in the evening because you're storing it up through the day. Subcutaneous but not visceral adipose tissue also displays a large amplitude circadian rhythm and insulin sensitivity. Adipose tissue's insulin sensitivity is 54% higher at noon than at midnight. So the later you get in the day, the less your fat tissue can take up fatty acids and glucose. And when it's not taking up fatty acids and glucose, that's remaining in the blood and that's causing insulin resistance. Free fatty acids exhibit diurnal rhythms that mirror the diurnal periodicity in glucose homeostasis. So they're doing the same thing as glucose. So in fact, eating not just glucose, but eating fat is going to cause the same hypertriglyceridemia, free fatty acidemia, or the larger amount of free fatty acids than if you eat them earlier in the day, because your body's going to take up those fatty acids and process them if you eat them in the morning, but it's not going to do so in the evening. So if you load your food starting in the noon and then afternoon and then evening, if you eat most of your food, then you're undermining your metabolic function. And there's some other stuff. There's a lot of other stuff. So we could read on. But I want to mention once again, a normal glucose metabolism becomes pre-diabetic in the evening. And a pre-diabetic glucose metabolism becomes diabetic in the evening. And this is supported by this extremely interesting meta-analysis, which looked at a daytime test between 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. and a nighttime test of 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. So this is a really extreme version of the same phenomenon. And they saw a really powerful and robust effect of a glucose tolerance test done early in the day versus later in the day. You have a much worse glucose tolerance later in the day. It just supports what we just said, but this is a systematic review and meta-analysis of just these studies, and there was 15 studies, and 10 of them were included in the meta-analysis. Okay, so, and just to be clear, there's yet another meta-analysis showing that there's no benefit to intermittent fasting compared to chronic calorie restriction in people with obesity or type 2 diabetes. And this is the same for people without obesity and type 2 diabetes. By the way, we just don't have a chance to review this right now. We're going to do that in the next video. But as I pointed out, the metabolic function of people on average, and it's probably consistent from individual to individual, but the study design didn't allow us to rule out that variation because of compounds outside of the study design control. Overwhelmingly, there's a strikingly large effect such that you want to eat your calories and especially your carbohydrates very early in the day, not at the evening. And if you do it in the evening, you're going to be predisposing yourself to obesity, excess body fat, etc., which over time, as Dr. Huberman has aged, it appears he has been exposed to an increased body fat and increased obesity as he's gotten older. I believe that his extremely unhealthy fasting practices have contributed to this obesity as he's gotten older, and he needs to stop extrapolating from them in order to make recommendations to people about intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is overblown. He needs to become up to date with the research. As a neuroscientist, he's not up to date with the research, and he's not competent to talk about this particular subject. And he's not doing the right and healthy thing for his own body. And so it's extremely important to mention that, to point that out again and again and again. He's not a nutrition expert. You shouldn't listen to him about nutrition. He's incompetent to talk about nutrition, and he's doing an extremely unhealthy thing to his body that's probably contributing to him becoming obese. Okay, so that's the video / podcast. I just wanted to point these things out. And if you like this content, find me at TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter at Kevin in Bass. That's 2 N's. Find me at Patreon, the same thing, Kevin in Bass, KevinnBass. You can become my patron and talk to me for 30 to 45 minutes per month. Hopefully don't talk to me for 30 to 45 minutes per day. I don't think there's anybody in my life right now I talk to for 30 to 45 minutes per day, except for maybe some of my coworkers. So you can do that 30 to 45 minutes per month by becoming one of the higher tier or the highest tier of on my Patreon, and that's about $100 a month. And then I'll hop on you on the phone, and we'll talk about any of these issues that I've been talking about on any of my videos over the past few years, or my blog posts, or anything like that. And I can give you the lowdown on your particular health concerns with respect to what the current body of literature says. I can also, if you sign up for some of the lower tiers, talk to you about anything you want about specific questions over text message. I do implore you, if you do such a thing, and if you're following me, make sure, if you are one of my patrons, to send me messages over Instagram or over Twitter, and not over Patreon, because I don't check Patreon very much. I try to avoid Patreon because it's just not like if I log on, the only reason is to check messages from followers. The best thing to do is to send a message on Twitter or on Instagram saying, hey, I'm one of your patrons. I need help with X, Y, and Z issue, and I will get to you immediately. Cool. And you can also support me at, of course, my website, thedietwars.com /support me /support-me. And that's a way to donate to me as well if you want to help me out, because I'm a student, I have 3 children, and I need money. So if you can help me on that way. But again, if you're a patron, I can help to answer more questions. I can prioritize questions. I don't have a team of people helping me out, unlike a lot of other influencers. I'm not really I don't have the money to hire a team. I'm just giving you the straight up information, and I'm personally answering all of your questions. Yeah, cool. So, and if you're listening to this over a podcast, you can go to my YouTube to see the full video versions of this. You can see a lot of interesting, the studies that I talk about, and as I'm reading, and you can look at them in the screen. You can learn more as I'm learning and as I'm teaching. And if you're on YouTube, you can also find these videos as on podcast form on my podcast called The Kevin Bass Show. You can find them on all major podcast directories. And please subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe. If you're on Instagram, subscribe. Like it. Share this. Let your friends know about this, because it's really important that people understand that Dr. Huberman's not the most healthy guy, and what he says isn't necessarily the right thing to be doing with your health. In some cases, this extremely unhealthy fasting style is something you want to avoid. I think I covered everything. Let me know what you think. Like, subscribe. As I said, drop a comment, ask a question. I get to those comments, the vast majority of the comments that I'm left. If I can, if they're actionable and like people aren't trolling, I get to them as soon as I can. So please leave a comment and let me know what you think about the video. And hope to see you in the next video. Talk with you guys later. Peace.